In the year 2017, I was a college student rushing a fraternity known for its strange hazing rituals. Whispers had circulated about a mandatory nighttime trip to an abandoned hospital a few towns away, and I felt both dread and curiosity stirring within me. This hospital was rumored to be haunted, carrying the weight of old tragedies in its long deserted halls. We kept telling ourselves it was just another pledge task, but in the back of my mind, I knew there was something unsettling about entering a place once crowded with people fighting for their lives. My heart pounded each time someone mentioned this tradition. I had just started meeting other pledge brothers, some of whom were friends from campus, while others were almost strangers. The shared concern among us made the idea even more charged. Part of the reason I stayed was because I did not want to show fear in front of older members, but deep down, the thought of stepping into those corridors at night caused my palms to sweat. Michael, one of the senior fraternity members, was the self-appointed guide for the trip. He boasted about how often he had gone there before and how he knew the best ways to sneak inside. Beside him was Eric, a fellow pledge and the person I felt closest to in our group. Although Eric rarely showed emotion, I could sense his anxiety. He asked me if I planned to stick close, and I assured him I had no intention of wandering off on my own. We were warned that security watched the hospital entrance around the clock. According to Michael, slipping in through a nearby park would be our safest bet. There was a small patch of woods behind the park's parking lot that opened onto the hospital grounds. It felt like some secret passage, a hidden path that would lead us straight into a place everyone else knew to avoid. The plan sounded simple on paper, but imagining it in the dead of night was enough to make my stomach clench. Later that evening, we gathered in the park under a dark sky. The street lamp nearest to our cars flickered like it might burn out at any moment, casting jittery shadows on the ground. We stood in a tight circle of quiet anticipation, checking flashlights and whispering about what might lie ahead. A few of the others forced laughter, trying to lighten the atmosphere, but I could see the tension in their eyes. When we finally headed through the strip of trees, every crunch of fallen leaves made me look over my shoulder. The hospital rose into view like a silent giant, its outline darker than the sky behind it. In that moment, I remember thinking it looked almost alive, as though it had been waiting for us all these years. With each step, I felt the weight of that old building pressing down on us, as if we were trespassers in a realm where no one was meant to return. We found the broken basement window exactly where Michael said it would be, a jagged opening that must have been shattered years ago. One by one, we lowered ourselves inside, boots splashing against the wet concrete floor. A damp odor hung in the air, carrying the smell of rotting drywall and something else I could not name. My flashlight revealed streaks of mildew on the walls, and water dripped from the ceiling in an occasional rhythm that set my nerves on edge. It surprised me that so much of the hospital remained intact. Rusted gurneys and mismatched chairs lined the corridors like forgotten sentinels, and the few doors we tested opened to reveal dusty waiting rooms still littered with broken equipment. It felt as though everything had been frozen in time since the day it closed. The heavy darkness in those empty passages was almost oppressive, like it wanted us to turn back before we could discover what lay beyond. After we wandered through the basement for a while, Michael gathered us near an old elevator shaft. He suggested splitting into groups to cover more ground before we left. My anxiety spiked at the thought, but Eric and I stayed together, both of us reluctant to face these corridors alone. The others drifted in opposite directions, some heading upstairs, others deeper into the labyrinth of rooms in the basement. Not long after we parted ways, Eric and I spotted something that made us freeze. At the far end of the hallway, just beyond the range of our beams, a shape flickered across our sight. It was human-sized, tall, thin, and eerily still for a moment. Then it slipped behind a corner without a sound. I felt a chill run through me as Eric whispered, asking if I had seen it too. We stood there, hearts pounding, unsure if we were imagining things or if someone was actually lurking in the dark. The thought of an unknown presence prowling the halls brought our external conflict to life. Rumors said the hospital was haunted, and the older fraternity brothers had hinted at disturbing encounters in these corridors. I remembered every ghost story I had heard, each one making my palms sweat a little more. If that figure was real, it meant we were not alone in this place, and whoever or whatever it might be could pose a real threat. Inside my head, a storm of questions and doubts churned. Was I letting the hospital's grim atmosphere warp my senses, or was there truly something to be feared here? My mind insisted we should keep moving, complete the pledge tradition, and not show panic. But my gut told me this was more than just an overactive imagination. I could almost feel the building's silence pressing in on me, urging me to decide whether to stay or run. Eric and I kept moving, determined to prove we could handle this pledge tradition. We stepped carefully over fallen ceiling tiles and broken glass, our flashlights guiding us through a maze of peeling paint and flickering shadows. Each door we passed led into a room still haunted by old bedding and scattered debris, and I could not shake the feeling that we were trespassing in someone else's nightmare. Despite the knot in my stomach, we pressed on, hearts thumping with every squeak of our shoes on the damp floor. Occasionally, we paused to listen for sounds from our fellow pledges. We assumed Michael and the others were investigating different parts of the building, but the silence in these hallways amplified our unease. Every once in a while, we caught faint echoes that might have been footsteps or distant whispers, yet nothing seemed certain in this place. Even the wind outside took on a strange tone when it passed through the broken windows, and I felt a chill each time it rattled the loose door frames. Eventually, we found ourselves in a corridor lined with battered examination rooms. The paint had flaked off the walls in uneven patches, leaving dark gashes that reminded me of old scars. Some of the doors were ajar, offering glimpses of rusted sinks and cabinets still stocked with dusty medical supplies. I shuddered at the thought of what once happened in these rooms, picturing doctors and patients bustling in and out, only for time to freeze here after the hospital closed down. It was in that dim corridor that the group finally converged again, though we were missing a few of the others. I remember Michael emerging from a side hallway, shining his beam across our faces and asking if we had seen anything unusual. I nodded, mentioning the figure Eric and I had glimpsed earlier. A few of the others traded nervous looks, whispering that they had also heard strange noises, but nobody could explain what was going on. Right then, in the middle of our hushed conversation, we heard the scream. It was a piercing, blood-curdling cry that sent every nerve in my body into overdrive. The sound tore through the corridors and rebounded against the walls, carrying what felt like sheer terror. My first thought was that someone had fallen or been attacked, but before any of us could agree on what to do, panic took hold. Several of us gasped and turned in the direction of the scream, only to be met with more darkness. That one moment tipped the balance between curiosity and dread. Adrenaline spiked through me, and I heard Eric call my name in a breathy shout. Whatever had caused that scream might still be lurking around the corner. My flashlight shook in my grip as I backed away from the corridor, trying to gather my thoughts. It felt as though the hospital itself had come alive for an instant, revealing a glimpse of something terrible. With fear pounding in my chest, I braced for whatever was coming next, unsure if we should stand our ground or run for our lives. I did not realize how quickly dread could turn to action. The instant we heard that scream, our entire pledge group bolted, sending us racing back in the direction we had come. My chest was tight with worry that we might run straight into whoever or whatever had made that horrific sound. Still, the only clear thought in my head was to get out, to reach the basement window as fast as possible. My heart pounded so fiercely it felt like it might burst out of my chest. Eric stayed at my side, breathing hard but refusing to let fear paralyze him. Michael shouted for everyone to stick together, though the echo of his voice bounced crazily off the walls, making it impossible to tell how close we all were. As we sprinted through the corridors, we passed the relics of the hospital's former life: abandoned wheelchairs, tangled cords, and soaked boxes stacked in corners. In my panic, these things felt like obstacles lying in wait to trip us up, or worse, hold us back. At one point, we nearly lost our bearings in the maze of identical hallways. Doors we had left open earlier suddenly loomed like black mouths, and for a terrifying second, I was sure we were trapped. Then I spotted the flicker of a flashlight reflecting off a wet floor sign we had passed before. Relief coursed through me, and we barreled ahead, ignoring the water splashing beneath our shoes and the ominous shadows in the corners of our vision. When we finally reached the basement window, I heard Eric let out a shaky laugh that sounded more like a sob. One by one, we clambered out into the cold air of the night. The breath I took outside never tasted sweeter, the cool breeze reminding me that I was still alive and, somehow, unharmed. Despite our trembling hands and racing pulses, we took a swift head count in the faint glow of the moon. Everyone who had come in with us managed to make it out. We hurried through the patch of woods, the park's parking lot now in sight. Even there, I had an irrational urge to keep looking over my shoulder, convinced that the figure we had glimpsed in the hospital might follow us. I was barely focused on the risk of security spotting us. The real threat still felt like it lurked somewhere behind, in that dark building. Thankfully, no one confronted us, and we made it to our cars without incident. Though we had survived, the events of that night left me more shaken than I wanted to admit. The shriek, the fleeting form in the corridor, and the damp, musty halls seemed burned into my memory. As I drove back to my dorm, I silently promised that I would never do anything like this again. Some places, I realized, should be left alone, no matter how strong the tradition or the dare. In the year 2017, that abandoned hospital would be the final time I willingly walked into the unknown.